APC is trying to do, or what we're trying to do with the APC to be more clear, is to ask the question, what if we only rely on admin data? And so we've produced a census only based on admin data, the first one released in 2021, and the second version in 2022. And this is really to understand the sources better, the admin data better, and also maybe sort of understand what would a future look like in which we only rely on admin data, or on admin data first to derive census information and not primarily on a survey. Now, all of this sort of use of admin data to produce census information has actually quite a long history. It's going back all the way to 2012 with the start of the census transformation strategy, with a short-term goal and medium-term goal to sort of modernize the then current census model, and the long-term goal to actually look at this possibility that I just mentioned about producing a census only based on admin data. All of that got a bit more impetus in 2015 with a cabinet decision. There was some other sort of experimental outputs that all of this builds on and relies on. We didn't really call them a census then, they were just population estimates. But they were basically the same idea, just growing, adding on more variables and so on. As mentioned in 2018, admin data was actually first used in the census to fill in any gaps left by the field enumeration. And then in 2021, we actually did release the first APC, and last year the second APC. And as you can see, a bit of growth there in terms of size, adding in a lot more variables. Now, I've also mentioned on the slide that in 2021, there was the government starter investment plan stating with a priority of producing more accurate frequent measurements of the population, and also Stats New Zealand's strategic intention of 2021 of less reliance on direct contact and more data and better data for and about Māori. And the subtext of both of these points being that admin data is one of the possible ways to hopefully go into that direction. And finally, and also as mentioned, the 2023 census that's currently ongoing actually does use admin data by design. Like from the beginning, it was always imagined to fill in the gaps, and everything has been set up in that way. But it's still using admin data as a secondary source, relying primarily on the field enumeration. So what are we trying to do with the APC? Our tagline is that we are a practical demonstration of what can be achieved now with admin data only to produce census type information. And I've highlighted the three words that I think are the most important there. The now, it's really just supposed to be a research project, a snapshot, sort of understand of how far we have come, how good we understand the admin sources, how good our methods are. It's relying only on admin data. There's a bit of an asterisk there because we do use Census 13 information to sort of fill in historic gaps, but rather think of that as historic admin data rather than census data. And finally, the one I think is most important, it's supposed to be practical demonstration. It really is supposed to look like a census, that the data has the same shape to help people understand the data and evaluate the data better. So the purpose, to be a bit more detailed, there's various wants. One of them being to sort of gauge the technical feasibility of an admin-first census, to enable a decision-making on any future model, sort of evaluate the data and the methods it used in the APC, but also enable engagement. And then use that feedback from engagement to sort of direct further development. Now, I did spell these out because I think they explain some of the design decisions we had to make. For example, for the first two, to sort of assess how good the admin data is that we have available and our methods. For example, we made the choice of not using Census 18 information. Even though it is there, it is linked, we could use it, it would probably improve the data that we could produce a lot. Fill in any sort of gaps, but it would give us the wrong impression in some sense. It would sort of like lead to the wrong conclusions. It wouldn't really answer the question of how would it look like if we primarily rely on admin data, because you'd always have this sort of like safety net. You never know how it would look like without this Census 18 safety net. And the last two enable the engagement and seek feedback. And for that, I think that the practical aspect is really important. It was really designed to elicit these sort of conversations for people to sort of look at the data and understand the data and tell us what they think. I think the nicest way of thinking about it is to think of the APC as a conversation catalyst, like it really sort of enabling these discussions about a possible change in the, well, a bit more detailed, what have we produced in terms of data? So unlike the census that only produces data for one point in time, we've actually produced an entire time series from 2006 to 2021. And for each of these years, centering around the reference date of the 30th of June, just because it sort of aligns with a lot of other outputs that Stats New Zealand has. And for each of these 16 reference dates, we derive a admin-based New Zealand resident population. If you're familiar with some of the sort of details, this is known also as basically the same as what's been known as the IDI-URB in the past, slightly more refined, some minor changes around the edges. And on top of that admin New Zealand resident population, we also add 19 census variables. They are the ones about sort of that you would expect population structure. So these are age, sex, geography, down to the address level, usual residence in years ago to sort of understand mobility, and number of children born for all females over 15. But then also importantly, identity and culture attributes, and ethnicity. If you're familiar with the ethnicity classification in use, that's actually going down to the lowest level, level 4, or the most detailed level, level 4. We also have Māori descent, birthplace, and for those who haven't been born in New Zealand, the year since arrival in New Zealand. And then 3 groups which we've added in this second iteration that we've released, which sort of added a lot to the growth. And these are income, education, and work variables. Before I go on, I should also say, so this was what the APC is. I should also add and hasten to add what the APC isn't. So it isn't Census 2023. That still relies on a field enumeration, as you will well be aware, because I hope you've all filled out your census form. However, having said that, some of the DNA is shared. As I mentioned, like some of the Census 23 model does use admin data to fill in gaps. The way this admin data is condensed from the sources available is, of course, sharing a lot of the same ideas and the same methodology. And of course, the admin sources to start with are shared. The APC also isn't Census 28. That model hasn't been decided yet. It's not clear what that will look like. We're currently in the sort of phase of making that decision as an organization. But it's not too far-fetched to say that, again, a lot of the sort of ideas and learnings from the APC will actually inform the decision-making, and then some of these ideas and methodologies might actually end up there again. It also isn't official statistics. This is a bit of a fine line to walk, because we're sort of trying to encourage people to say, here's our data, please use it, but at the same time, here's our data, please don't use it for any sort of important decision making. So it's this sort of fine line to walk, but overall, it's actually, the data is looking reasonably good, as you'll see. And finally, it also doesn't represent all of the sort of research that is going on, all of the avenues we're exploring. There's a lot of bits and pieces from census that are missing in the APC, things like dwellings, household and families. There's this whole area about population estimation, so this sort of adjustment layer where we normally use like dual system estimation techniques to adjust for undercoverage in the census. Like all of these sort of bits and pieces and parts, research is going on. I won't really talk that much about them in this. Now, from the beginning, the whole APC had been designed and conceived as sort of an iterative process. That is, it was always planned to have multiple iterations, multiple releases from year to year. go out, engage on these releases, engage on the data, take the feedback that we have back and then sort of feed it into the next iteration. And of course, we also did a lot of sort of learning, and then you do understand the admin data better and you introduce improvements. The other thing on this slide maybe to talk about is what sort of data is available where. So all of the APC is produced in the IDI. And there in the IDI, Stats New Zealand's integrated data infrastructure, you hopefully are aware of that and what that is. In there, researchers who are who have IDI access can actually access our unit record data. So we do sit there under the data schema. And all the unit record data is available. That has always been the case. One new addition this year is that we've added a spells table, meaning that you're not sort of bound to that 30th of June reference date. You can actually produce the population and the added attributes for pretty much any day, any reference date between 2006 and 2020. There's certain limitations. I don't want to go into details too much. We've also added some unit record quality scores in the unit record data. So really each sort of attribute for each unit record coming with a score of how good we think that particular number or that particular value is. And also unnecessarily, almost to add, we've also released a lot of our source code, the metadata, to really help people understand the data. Now, publicly available outside the IDI, on the Stats New Zealand website. If you do Google Stats New Zealand and APC, you'll easily find us. If you only Google APC, you'll end up at the annual practicing certificate for nurses. So we haven't quite yet managed to overwhelm Google, but maybe one day we'll come up as the first choice. Anyway, outside on our website, you'll find a whole lot of sort of aggregate tables released or taken from the IDI. There's also an interactive app, which I'm going to mention in a second or talk about a bit more. And there's a methodology report. We've released one for 2021 and an even more detailed one for 2022. And there's also for information by variable, you'll find, if you're particularly interested in one of the attributes, a lot of detail about that variable, a lot of quality assessment, yeah, just a whole lot more explanation. And finally, the other thing we've also released last year for the first time was a condensed paper with information for Māori. Again, you can find that on the website as well, containing just the parts of the APC that we think is of most importance to Māori, and is also hopefully a bit easier to digest than the rather technical sort of methodology report. And needless to say, we also have plans for the next iteration, but more on that hopefully later. So if you go on the website, a few lines down, you'll find this interactive app that I mentioned. It basically looks like this. There's a few tabs. The nicest view is probably the sort of map view. And on the left side, you can select various things. You can select the year that you're interested in. Some of the covariates, and of course the attribute, and then it will sort of like display that information nicely on a map of New Zealand. You can zoom in, you can switch on roads so that you can find your own area. And it's really, as I've mentioned before, trying to encourage people to interact with the data and to explore the data and helping them to understand the data better. There's also a tab where you can look at nice graphs, sort of like development over time. And you can download specific tables, which is quite useful. It's the same information that's provided in the summary tables, but it's filtered and personalized. Of course, because it's data that's not unit record data anymore, it's taken out of the IDI. There's somewhat limited crosstabs available, so you can't, of course, look at every possible combination of education, income, things you could do with the unit record. Of course, there's too many possibilities to combine that with age, years, and so on, that we had to make some some decisions of what these sort of like possible combinations are. All right. Maybe what have we learned so far? The first thing is that, and maybe it's a bit of a selection of the things we've learned. There's of course a lot more detail to this as well. The first one being that the ethnicity information, at least for level 1 and 2, is actually of fairly high quality. And I'll go into a bit more detail in some of the later slides. The quality of Māori descent is not quite there yet. And again, there's more detail coming up. The TLDR there is that the quality is mainly driven by missingness. So we are missing values rather than for the people for which we have information, the quality is actually quite high, but there's just a large group of people for which we don't have this information from admin data. We've also learned, and this won't really come as a surprise, that there's definitely a need for deeper consultation throughout the planning and engagement periods. And this, of course, needs to be slightly wider than the APC. All of the sort of movement of Stats New Zealand towards an organization that uses more and more admin data it requires a lot of conversations and engagement beyond the APC, really. There's also one of the areas that is mentioned quite often is that there is a potential for the inclusion of iwi affiliation that's not currently included. Just in terms of sort of demand, this is a frequently requested thing that if we could possibly do that, that would be great, that sort of thing. And finally, and this is where we might be hoping for a bit of feedback today as well, as I've mentioned, we are sort of limited in the crosstabs that we can provide outside of the IDI, but there's just too many possibilities. So there we're really very keen to hear if you have very specific use cases in mind. If you think there's certain combinations that would be very, very interesting, we'd be interested to hear to sort of understand what data people are actually looking for. Because we were just talking about iwi and Māori data needs in particular, we do understand the data needs of iwi and Māori to some degree. There has been a paper about the iwi data needs, and just going into some of the details about that paper that you will, I guess, be familiar with. We can pull out a few points where the APC helps in that to sort of address these points. I'm not saying that it solves every single problem and fulfills every single data need in there, obviously, just making the point that there are certain aspects that you can see where the sort of experimental work is already sort of going into the right direction. So that paper does mention the need for more timely, more detailed and more frequent data and measurement, particularly of the Māori populations. And that's a definite yes. As I've mentioned, we have data for all years, not just the census years. There's a lot more frequent data available, and it's also in some sense a lot more detailed. Again, details coming up. More relevant data, again, going to the right direction. Some of the, so what the APC allows us to do, because it is part of the IDI, as the sort of like centralized point, it allows the connection to other research, sort of providing uniform populations that people can base their research on and hopefully able to make a lot more research comparable. So sort of being the conduit that a lot of the other research and linking can feed through. And yes.
How are you getting this data? What part of the IDI are you using to get this data?
All right, I can skip a million slides, don't worry. So we use quite a few data sources, admin sources in the IDI, basically pretty much all of the ones that are there that you can think of. And the details of this slide also don't really matter too much. I think the takeaway is we use different parts for different attributes. For example, for getting birthplace, there we rely on DIA data to see who's born in New Zealand. but we also rely on customs data and MBIE data, visa data to get birthplace and condense those two for that attribute.
What about the electoral roll? Is that of any use?
It was on the list of things to mention at some point during this talk. So far, we weren't allowed to use the electoral roll for statistical production. You were allowed to use the electoral roll for one-off research purposes. However, with the change of with the new Data and Statistic Act that just came into force last year that replaced the original 1975 Act, that actually does enable the use of the electoral roll. And we have started as an organization to get hold of this data, this sort of understanding, ingesting the data, but we still need to do the research of like looking at the data, seeing how it fits in. For example, one of the places where we do hope that it will help a lot of the gap filling the electoral roll is for that gap in Māori descent that I mentioned before. But just to mention detail there, it's a slightly different classification. For example, on the electoral roll, it's a yes/no question. In the census context, we have yes, no, don't know. So there are some questions about how to combine them and what the output actually means and what it looks like. So details. Is that?
Yeah, that was good. Thanks.
All right. Now, Renee specifically asked me to comment on the ethics of using admin data. That's also actually quite nicely aligns with the question about the using electoral roll. Now, that's a very hard question to answer. I guess naturally, I'd say that personally, I think it's ethical to do that. Stats New Zealand obviously thinks it's ethical to do that. I think in general, it's a question that's probably not answerable. As a mathematician, what I'm going to do is probably answer a slightly different question. So maybe talk about some of the aspects around it. One of them is the legality of the whole thing. As mentioned, we just have a new Statistics Act. So legally, we're on very, very solid ground. And it's not that the previous act didn't allow the use of admin data for statistical purposes. It was just that it was written in 1975, and it didn't have a lot of things in mind like digital registers and all of these things. It didn't mention data at all as just as a word, for example. And the new act is a lot more modernized and really enables this use a lot better. And for example, it also puts an onus on the data suppliers to inform Stats New Zealand if they make any changes to the way they collect their data, things like that. Another aspect to maybe mention is it's not just a question about whether it is ethical per se to use admin data to produce statistical information. It's also a question of whether the production itself is done in an ethical way. So this is sort of linking up to aspects of privacy, security, confidentiality. And again, I think there we are on reasonably solid grounds. At Stats New Zealand have very well-established protocols of, confidentializing data, random rounding, perturbing suppression, rules that we, of course, also follow with the APC. And independently of that, the IDI has even stricter rules and has its own rules. And as we are a project in the IDI, we have to follow their rules and all as well. And of course, there we adhere to those standards as well. So that is the Ngā Tikanga Pahiera framework that the IDI has developed, but that's a lot more general actually than just applying purely to IDI research. It's a framework that can actually be applied to more generally to all sorts of data-driven research. So that covers aspects of are the people informed? Is the data in safe hands? Or all of these? Is it treated in a safe way? All of these sort of aspects. And finally, maybe mention trust and confidence, which is maybe the slightly more important question, rather than is it ethical to do so? Will people see it as ethical? Do the people of New Zealand have the trust and confidence? in data being produced by admin data. There, my comment would be mainly that it should not really be thought of as sort of like a one tick box exercise where we have to gain the trust and confidence license to do this sort of thing, and then it's fine. I think it's more of an ongoing process of where this trust and confidence needs to be maintained. One of the ways to maintain this trust and confidence is hopefully by being transparent, by, as we're trying to do with the APC in particular, to explain our methods, to make the algorithms available, to really enable people to look at and sort of like understand what we're doing. And the other thing is, I think most of the trust and confidence will probably actually come from producing useful data. I think most people are probably quite happy for their data to be reused if they get if it's not seen as a one way, like the government is collecting data and then doing something with it, but rather it is collected by the government for various reasons, and then we reuse it, provide statistics that are then useful again for everybody and are provided to everybody. And again, I hope that the APC does a little bit of that with providing as much data as we possibly can and make it accessible. All right, getting maybe to a few more data specific points. Maybe it's also interesting to just mention our sort of like quality measurement strategy, like how we assess the data, how we think or how we derive our sort of evaluation. So this sort of breaks down in a qualitative part and a quantitative part. Qualitatively, we've done quite a lot of groundwork, especially in the early years. If you think back of the second slide, the history 2012, just collecting information, understanding how is the data collected, what is the purpose of the collection, because that obviously helps you understand the data better. And also what happens in the ingestion process, how is it linked, how can errors, for example, sort of enter the system, and all of these questions. Quantitatively, we rely on a few metrics, one of them being coverage, like just if we have the population and we have an attribute, for how many people in the population can we actually produce this attribute? There again, hopefully the higher the better. In terms of numbers, we can also compare the aggregate statistics that we can produce with other statistics, like the ones that rely on 2018 census, and that being the reason not to include census 18 data, for example, so that we have this independent list, independent information, source of information that we can compare with. But of course, also other things like the estimated resident population that we can compare our population counts with. And there's also other statistics, say Ministry of Education producing some education statistics that we can compare our numbers with to understand that. Because we have census 18 as a unit record file, and we have all of our data as unit record as well, in the IDI, we can actually also do a unit record comparison. So we can really look at specific units and compare how well is the agreement at that level. And that is another sort of measure of how good we are, how consistent things are. Of course, that you can only do in 2018 if you have a list to compare against. And finally, we've also derived some other methods, or we've experimented with other methods. We've been using one based on Dempster-Schafer theory. I don't want to go into details there, but it's basically just looking across different sources. If an attribute is available from different admin sources, how well is the agreement within those sources? And how well does that agree with the value that we've chosen? And again, the more the agreement there is, the higher the score and the lower. So what that allows us to do is sort of move beyond 2018 and have some sort of score that also works in other years where you don't have this list to compare against. All right, some data. Before I can show you some graphs, I have to show you the IDI disclaimer. maybe starting with an overall sort of quality, because we were just talking about the quality. So the main sort of measurements being the missingness and the consistency with 2018, comparing on a unit record level data, and then basically multiplying those two numbers to get an overall output score for the whole population for that attribute. Too many numbers to ingest. The thing to mainly look at, if you look at the second column, so this is the consistency. So this is for where we have a value, how good is the value? How well does it agree with a census response? And overall, as you can see, the agreement is actually reasonably high with a few outliers, but those won't really surprise you. For example, Malay is quite a tricky ethnic group conceptually, and the other ethnic group at level 1 is very, very small and also conceptually somewhat tricky. So it's not that surprising to see bad consistency there. What mainly drives the output quality is actually the missingness. And there I highlighted that aforementioned gap in Māori descent, where for 14% of the population, we don't actually have a value at all. But again, for the ones where we have a value, it's actually, the quality is quite high.
This is only comparing what you have with those that completed census 2018.
Yes.
So
yes, when we compare
the
census.
It's a little bit unfair, given that there is actually an important denominator missing.
Yes, so the missingness is within the APC. So within the APC population, there's 14% for which we can't fill the Māori descent value.
But we know that there's an important portion of Māori Pacific who didn't complete.
There's also missingness in the census. So this is just of the people who are in the APC and at the same time have answered census 18, how good is the agreement for that overlap? And then, of course, making the slight leap of faith of assuming that that is more generalizable to other people in the APC.
So you've got people who will be in your APC.
Yep.
Who were in 2018 census because they were drawn from the admin.
Yes, and that's the second point. I should have added. The second thing I should have added as well, when I say comparison with census 18, we only compare with the responses, the true, not the true responses, the field enumeration responses. We obviously filter out any of the things that have been filled in with admin information, because otherwise, yes, it would be quite silly. We would be comparing admin information with admin information.
But can you trust this data when the quality of the 2018 census wasn't very good? So you're producing data here based on a census.
I guess if you say that the quality of the 2018 census wasn't as good, I think it's almost like a similar picture as here. I think what most people probably think about is that the response rates were far lower than we would have hoped for. So it is also like a missingness problem, rather than I think saying that, oh, that was conducted in such a bad way that people didn't fill it in properly. I think of the people who did answer the 2018 census, I think we can make the assumption that that is very, very high quality data, and that is the right response. I think the problem with the quality is more the missingness, the people who didn't answer the census to start with.
And then the quality assessment of the admin data that was used to backfill the census, which is slightly different to the quality assessment that you have here.
That's derived from spatial units, isn't it? The area census area units. So it's missing at the finer scales. It's not based on a general New Zealand scale, but it's missing at a census area unit scale.
What do you mean by that?
Well, you're calculating the population of Māori for different area units, right?
So this comparison here, as I said, like the second column is on a unit record level. So this is actually taking individuals in the admin data that are linked to individuals in the census and comparing that on that level. Because we
Yeah.
can,
So
but
that-
of course we can only.
So there's a geography to this, so can you map out where you got the missing data on that?
Yeah, of course. And this is
So
some
what
of
parts
the,
the country, where is it missing?
yes. Queenstown is particularly bad. A lot of the Māori descent missingness is actually driven by the overseas population, which conceptually makes sense. Because it's, and that actually brings me to the next slide again, how Māori descent is derived. So we're mainly there, like for many other attributes, we're relying on sort of like rank methods where we have analyzed the sources that are available and sort of take the best available source. And if there's no information available from that source, we sort of start relying on the next one. So for Māori descent, we don't actually have that many admin sources available. As you've mentioned, electoral roll would be a fantastic one to have, hopefully. But we do have DIA data. It is a question there whenever you're born, and if you ever have a child, as a parent, you get asked that. So we take the DIA response there, prioritizing parents' response over the children, because we do want to prioritize responses over proxy responses rather than somebody filling it in for their child. It's not the child itself answering that question, it's somebody else filling it in for them. So if we have information from DIA where you were a parent for the Māori descent attribute, we do use that. If not, maybe we have your birth register as a child, we use that. And that gets you to 49% of the population. Now, that has only been started, that information has only been collected since 1995. So for anybody who was born before 1995 or didn't have a child after 1995, we do need to get this information from somewhere else. Here we immediately fall back on this sort of like historic admin data of Census 2013, and that obviously fills a large gap there, and that gets you to 85%.
Basically, you're missing all the people that go overseas and all that.
Yes, exactly. So it's mainly driven, the missingness here is by the overseas born population that hasn't had a child in New Zealand. So again, like we do understand the missingness problem quite well. We do have some hope, or we do have a lot of hope in the electoral roll data is sort of like sustainable going forward, something that will be filled in by most people.
About inland revenue, they just want to have a job, wouldn't they, and be having some income?
They don't collect that information.
No.
No.
You don't collect RFC always.
So don't you have like an ID for each person and you can cross-link them and all that?
Well, there's linking done, there's probabilistic linking done in the IDI. But yeah, for somebody who was born overseas, even if all of the data sets are linked, if none of the data sets has Māori descent available for that person.
Education, health?
No. So this goes back to talking about this is what we can achieve now with deriving census information from admin data. There is, of course, the potential to maybe go to the Ministry of Education and then ask, and then get them to start collecting this information. For, I think, tertiary students, they already collect iwi affiliation, for example. So it would be quite natural to also collect that information. But that doesn't help us right now. That might help us.
So you're saying education and health don't collect ethnicity information?
They collect ethnicity, Māori descent.
Okay.
Ethnicity, same picture as before, and I'm terribly running out of time. But ethnicity is actually, we're quite in a luxurious position because there are a lot of different admin sources available. It is collected by a lot of different sources.
So with ethnicities, let's say you are defining in the APC, the ethnicity, you're taking it from say 5 different sources, and if all of them have say for some reason different ethnicities for one person, so is that person counted in each of those ethnic groups?
So again, we're using a ranked method in that we've sort of like ranked the sources, and for every person we sort of go through the sources, look, is it available in DIA? Is it available in Ministry of Education tertiary data? Is it available in Ministry of Health? And until we sort of run out of sources. And at the end, we use 2013 to sort of fill in any gaps.
So basically you just recording one ethnicity for each person.
No, we collect all of the ethnicities that are selected in
Different sources.
in a source.
I
Because
mean,
each of these sources will collect multiple ethnicities. We have also been doing some research of slightly breaking that pattern. There's some research we've done on using latent class modeling, more like methods that look at all of the sources at the same time. And I think there is definitely scope for improvement, and maybe that is something to sort of finish on two slides, is the data actually looks quite good. So here's only the Māori ethnicity usual resident population, and comparing the counts in 2018 from the APC with the 2018 census counts, and with the adjusted, that's the yellow line, the estimated resident population that adjusts using the post-enumeration survey for undercoverage in the census. And I mean, there's obviously some differences here, but overall, I think it's quite reassuring of how close these patterns really are. So it's safe to say that all of these measure the same concept. Having said that, there are some fine distinctions. For example, you can see here that the APC seems to be missing some of the, I think this is like sort of like 15 to 19-year-olds. Doesn't have as much problem as census to pick up the 20 to 30-year-olds. So there's these fine sort of nuances.
How does this graph look at a sub-regional level? Because I'm assuming.
Yes, as you go down, so this is also just the national picture. If you start going down, breaking it down by, say, geography, TALBs, regions, SA2s, and so on, of course, you'll see a lot more variation, as you would expect.
similarly, really importantly, at the more finer grain level for the ethnicity data for the non-Māori population. It's quite concerning that one of your hierarchies for ethnicity data is primary and secondary Ministry of Education data, because that ethnicity data is really poor quality and is not collected. I mean, we're still undergoing the ethnicity standardization process, which will be really important, but at the moment it's not even the standard census question in those data sources.
It is this, so these have been ranked in how well they agree with census 18. So just overall.
For level 1.
Just this is yes, this is level 1.
Yeah.
It includes level 2 as well.
Yeah. But the ranking is done on. Okay. There's a lot more to say, and there's a lot more scope for improvement, but overall, the agreement is maybe surprisingly high. Maybe I can show you another slide with graphs. So this is the quality of the Pacific ethnicities at level 2 and 3, leaving out the other sort of categories. And again, you can see that the counts from census and the APC are actually remarkably close, even if you break it down by 5-year age groups.
Except for BG.
Except for one, and this is the sort of analysis that we're doing, and this is why we're doing it, and sort of like understanding these things. There, we do actually know, or we think we know what's going on. This is probably something to do with the way that ethnicity is collected, say at Ministry of Health, at the GP, because there's not just the Fijian category, there's also the Fijian Indian category, which is sitting in a different, sitting under the Asian ethnicity classification. So what is happening there, the overcount will probably be a lot of Fijian Indians being counted as Fijian in admin data.
And again, sorry, the denominator, so the comparison, the 2018 census comparison here is those that completed the 2018 census.
So these are now not unit record information anymore. This is now the aggregate information. So this will be including the admin field, including statistical imputation.
Okay, so you're,
okay.
you're including those that, whose 2018 census data comes from admin data.
Yes, so some agreement there will happen. However, I mean, even though 2018 response rates were rather low, it is still like, at least, I mean, again, it's depending on the ethnicity specifically, so it's really hard to talk about, but 75, 80% at least.
Well,
in
lower for
those-
Pacific.
Yeah, lower.
Yeah,
I don't.
so
don't
I
know what
think
was-
it would be really interesting to look at this comparison where you didn't use the admin data in the 2018 census included as the comparison.
Yeah, then you obviously, you'll see the census data being a lot lower. Then I guess the fairer comparison would be in terms of distribution, in the proportions.
Well, that would be a fair comparison, because what you're saying here is that our admin data is just as good as our 2018 census data, without saying, but for around about a third of the Pacific population, and again, higher for level 2,
Yeah,
you're comparing your admin data with your admin.
you could filter those out, take those out in both lines, because we
I think you need to do that
could link those up.
to
yes.
provide a robust quality assessment.
Guess we should want to compare with the truth, don't you? What's closest to the truth?
Wait, we don't have the truth.
Yeah, I know. So yeah, that's why I asked, what's the quality?
Or that
Closest to-
proportion.
All right, I think in the interest of time, as you might expect, and as you might have seen, I have a million slides. But maybe if you allow me to show one more slide of the sort of things which are quite exciting, which we can do. So there's a lot more frequent data, and basically have a census as often as you'd like. You could have a quarterly census. You could run this process and then produce census information, more data than you could hopefully ever hope to analyze. One of the interesting things we haven't mentioned yet is that it's not just that there's more frequent data available, but it's all longitudinally linked on a unit record data level. And that is something we haven't really explored that much, but that allows you to look at things that you couldn't really look at with the traditional way we've used census information. So you can't just look, and here's an example between Hamilton and Tauranga. You can't just look at how many people lived in Tauranga over the years, how many people lived in Hamilton for each of the reference states. You can also see how many people actually moved from one year to the other, from Hamilton to Tauranga, and the other way around, even though in the aggregate numbers, they would cancel each other out. I'm not sure if this is a particularly interesting pattern, but yes.
So I've been thinking back of my mind that this APC is kind of finding a New Zealand version of what would be called population registration data in Scandinavia and the Netherlands, which I'm familiar with. Now, actually, this is can be more powerful because there's a limit to what these registration systems collect. But on the other hand, they're incentives for people to register or deregister, because if you don't register, you don't get any services. If you don't deregister, like for example, I lived there in recent years, if we hadn't deregistered and therefore signaled our migration leaving the country, we would have continued to have to pay taxes. So the question in this context, I'm particularly interested in, this was something really hard in the past in New Zealand, getting to grips with emigration, people leaving New Zealand and at different spatial levels, which of course always it's always a residual. As people have been demographically calculating that immigration residual, but you have some means here, correct?
Yes, you could actually easily identify people who have emigrated, and then because it is reiterating for the millionth time, it is like having the entire information available. You can start analyzing this and look at the age structure, look at the education level, like all of these things you could easily do. Like it's mentioned, like we're only sort of starting to scratch the surface of the things that are really possible with this sort of information. Yeah. But I think I should probably stop at this point. I'm more than happy, and we are more than happy to hang around and continue any conversation, but I think for the formal part, let's stop.
What would you say is your best data source? admin data.
Well, the DIA generally seems to be
Is it?
overall, well, again, it depends like what attribute is used for. I think DIA for the data that's collected
What
seems
do
to
they
be.
know about us at an individual level?
My theory would be that it's if you have a child, it's such a like momentous event that you do sort of like, take care in filling out the forms, and you really start to think of, this is the birth certificate that they're going to carry around the rest of their life. You're going to put some effort into thinking what ethnicities do I want to write down.
Slide 29 has one.
They wouldn't know if you left the country or not.
No,
But that doesn't matter, does it?
it's everything's linked, that's the power of it.
Yeah, okay, I just wondering, I would have thought health would be pretty good, because most people register the health service pretty quickly.
I think you really have to break it down for what you want to use the data for. Like we use, for example, health as an activity check, signs of life to make sure that people are still in the country, to sort of filter the admin population. And there, yeah, it's very good because people do interact with the health system quite often. Some of the ethnicity information, for example, from health is known to be slightly problematic. So it really depends of what you use it for. And this goes back to what I've said, and like it is really important to understand your sources and to understand what they're collecting the data for, and thereby informing how we can reuse the data.
And I think that's a really important point, which comes back to your point, Jacques, that this is not, yes, it might act like a population register, but it's not a population register. It hasn't been set up that way. And our admin sources that are being used as the source for this register haven't been set up this way. And so, you didn't really discuss the data sovereignty considerations, but, the data sovereignty considerations include not only the governance over this, so it'll be really interesting to understand if that's connected to the governance that needed to be put in place with the 2018 census challenges, and then also includes that interpretation challenge. So it's absolutely critical that everybody understands the limitations of the sources of the data and the IDI, but nobody does. So I sit on the Health Research Council Public Health Committee, and we have a process underway with our Ethics Committee for the Health Research Council, looking at whether what the implications are for IDI research to do health research. And the number one implication is that the vast majority of applications to do health research that state that they're going to use the IDI don't actually understand the data sources in the IDI that they're planning on using and the limitations of those. So those data are typically deficit, and also they're collected in a very different way to what a lot of the research questions are that might want to use the APC or might want to use the IDI. So it is really important that we have that social license conversation, that we have that governance conversation, and that we understand that creating such a resource might be fabulous, but it might really also stimulate additional deficit-based framing of outcomes, particularly for Māori and Pacific, and that ethnicity piece is really important. And I think there's another question, Renee, I know we've run out of time, but Jamie Veal asked a question also about important populations and how they may or may not be represented in admin data.
Sorry, team.
It's all right. Can you open up the chat? There it is, just in there. Yeah.
Okay, there we
What
go.
are your plans to collect data about rainbow communities with admin data, sexuality, gender, or transgender status?
That was mentioned on one of the slides as one of the sort of like blind spots currently. Stats New Zealand has developed a standard. I think that's been in some of the previous years. And as the sort of like data system leadership role that Stats New Zealand has sort of pushed it out to other agencies to start collecting it. The information is obviously also for the first time collected in the 23 census. In terms of admin data, you of course have a bit of a lag there in that it hasn't been collected to this point. And it's sort of like, it's hard to see like how it's been collected by what agency. And what has been done to it until we sort of see the data. Where was I going with that? So there's the groundwork has been laid in some sense, but of course to start seeing this in admin data will take quite a long time. So this might be some of the information that for some time might need to be collected in a different way, like through surveys.
All right, do we have any more questions from our online whānau? No, we might close off from now and continue this conversation here in the room. Yeah, so we'll call it a conclusion.
I was wondering the same question as Richard said, will
Oh,
the
absolutely.
PowerPoint presentation be available? And if so, how would we get our hands on it?
Totally. Okay, so just to kind of wrap up, thank you for attending, everyone. Absolutely, the slides and the recording will be on our Diener website, www.diener.waikato.ac.nz. So yeah, you can find that by just Googling Diener. If you know of any of your friends or colleagues that might like to join our mailing list to have invitations to future seminars, please also find my contact details on the Diener website. So what I'll do now is I think I'll finish recording. I think there's going to be a little bit more of a kōrero going on in this room. If anyone wants to leave the online version, please do. If you want to stick around to listen, you're more than welcome. Ka kite anō. Have a great, what day are we? Tuesday. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.